The cartlet door. The cartlet door. I'm serious. He's dope. He's like an image of a glass man. You can't really see him. So we gonna roll with that.
Would you like to play the piano, or would you like to play your flute? Here, play your flute. Let's play the right end. That's the wrong end. That's, yeah. Hit C above G.
Insight, foresight, more sight. The clock on the wall reads a quarter past midnight.
Okay, evening everyone, welcome. Welcome to Life-Affirming Infrastructures. I'm Stephanie from Healing Justice London, and this is part of the Rehearsing Freedoms Festival. Rehearsing Freedoms is a month-long multi-site festival of community health, healing, movement building, arts and culture initiated by Healing Justice London, which asks, how can we root visions for radical and just health in safety, dignity and belonging, in order for us all to live whole and flourishing lives? What capacity, skills and strategies do we need to practice to help us get free together? Healing Justice London builds community-led health and healing to create capacity for personal and structural transformation. We work on a community, structural and movement level to prepare and build the conditions for health and healing justice that dignify and support all of us to be well. So thank you for joining us this evening, here in the room and also online. We know this is a sold out event, and people right now have got very full lives going on with the current context and being involved in actions. So we've at Healing Justice London, we've been trying to pivot the festival in order to hold that. And we'll be holding a kind of communal gathering and grief space on Saturday here for the end of the festival. Folks are welcome to come. There'll be food, and we can be together. So before we start tonight, before I hand over to Akil, our chair, just some notes about access. We aren't expecting a fire alarm, but if one does go off, please go that way. There'll be a fire exit that way with stairs, and also a lift if you need one, which is usable within a fire. We have lots of snacks and drinks over in the corner, so please fill your boots and make the most of them. It gets a little bit chilly in here as well, so feel free to use the throws that are on your seats. And we also have in the corner a really nice chill space, so if you want to go over there and make use of that, please do so. I'm going to, run through just very quickly what we're to expect for the session. So we're going to run from now until about 7:45 and have a break. And then we'll come back around 8 o'clock for another hour of the questions and answers. Okay? So now I'm going to hand over to our chair, Akil Smith. He's one sixth of Resolve, an interdisciplinary design collective that aims to address multi-scalar social challenges by combining architecture, art, technology, and engineering. Resolve has delivered numerous projects, workshops, and talks in the UK and across Europe, as well as working with a variety of initiatives to introduce young people from underrepresented backgrounds to concepts in interdisciplinary design. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you, Akil.
Evening, everyone. So thanks so much for that. My name's Akil, and here we have a panel of really some of the most inspiring practitioners, I think, who are in the field today. How the conversation is going to go is that we're going to do an introduction per panelist. Each panelist will introduce themselves, then we'll take a little 10-minute break, shake it off, and then we'll come back and I'll start with those questions, taking us from the past to the present to the future, and then we'll also open it up to the floor for those questions as well. The talk is around life-affirming infrastructures, as you've seen from the title, and how we are prefiguring this idea is through the practices of the really amazing people that you have in front of you today. We're really thinking about and trying to get into the structures that underpin our tangible and intangible realities. Sometimes that's through city planning, other times that's through community activism and entrepreneurship. And so you'll see and hear around a kind of range of methods in that respect. The work that we do, I think, always intersects with an advocacy for human life, an advocacy for the oppressed, and for social justice. We're obviously speaking at a time of great sadness, great sorrow for the genocide in Gaza, and it's only right to be able to mention that and to say that openly in terms of how our allegiance, and also particularly my allegiances as well. The way that we work in all of our practices is as part of an ecology, part of a kind of history of different organizations going through and working sometimes against or sometimes with the powers that be. And so we're going to take ourselves on a journey in order to do that. So Very quickly, I'll introduce myself in the following slides. Then I'm going to hand over to Yvonne to introduce herself as well. We switched around the order. Then Imi's going to go, and then Gabriella. So I won't say too much about their bios because they'll be doing a lot of the talking themselves. So for me, very quickly, like I said, I run Resolve Collective, which is an interdisciplinary design collective. We work between art, architecture, engineering and technology to address social issues. A lot of the work revolves around a design philosophy that we call using the site as a resource. And for us, that means the appraisal of both local knowledge, but also local materials. That work kind of manifests in lots of different ways, but it's community-centered and it thinks of design as a process. That then manifests in lots of different kind of languages, some of which are interventions in the built environment, some of which are installations within space and institutions. They're always around creating spaces for practitioners and the practitioners around us, the ecology of practitioners around us. They inhabit these abandoned spaces and they make use of material as a means of doing that. There are ways of working in order to think about the process and the journey of manifesting and creating with materials, but also thinking about our tangibility and how we can take our dreams into real life. That's worked with a series of communities, with groups, but also in an acknowledgement of the histories and the political cycles of materiality as well, particularly at the overlapping crises that we face as well. I think that this practice kind of becomes increasingly important. We sometimes work within the formal architectural realm, master planning strategies, etc., but that's always with a focus on communities and how that those processes become centered around the voices of the communities, particularly those who are underrepresented, and as I said, material plays a big part. So as well as the work occupying all of these spaces, sometimes even also the digital spaces, it really is around this idea of design of the process. And that is something which, importantly, and we'll get to this during the talk, is, I think, an inheritance, something which has been passed down to us and also imbued to us by the ecology of practitioners around us. We don't stand alone in this by any means. We are part of a huge rhizomatic network of practitioners sharing visions for abolition, sharing visions for liberation and emancipatory practices, and that is me. So I'm going to now pass it on to Yvonne. And we're also going to do a musical chairs because the clicker wasn't working.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Oh, good evening, everyone. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you this evening. So I'm going to sort of be this way slightly so that I can see the screen as well as talk to you. So excuse me if my body language is a little bit uneven. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about myself, how I landed doing what I've been doing for the past 45 years, and actually plus, and talk a bit about the organisation that I currently lead. I have been involved in community development, community responses over several decades. And actually, I started my professional work as a youth worker in Lambeth, so it's really nice to be back in Brixton. So, okay, now how am I going to do this? Is someone timekeeping? Please. Okay, so just a little bit about me. I wear many hats and many disguises, sometimes simultaneously and sometimes independently, depending on where I am, who I'm with, what I'm doing, and how I want to engage in systems. I have over the decades described myself as a change maker, as an activist, as a social entrepreneur, as a pracademic, because I have worked in academia, but I'm very practice-focused, and I do believe that theory comes out of practice as opposed to the other way around. And at the moment, I'm CEO and founder of an organization called the Ubele Initiative. Ubele means the future, or the way ahead in Swahili, and we've built it from bottom up. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what we've been doing. Actually, you know, there's always a story behind why we do what we do. And I know, Imi, you've heard this story before about my mother. I usually include a picture of my mother, who was from the Windrush generation. She passed away 2011. However, when I was 11 years old in 1971, so that does tell you how old I am, if you can do the math, she campaigned for my educational rights. I was homeschooled for 3 months. During that period, we campaigned with a group of black students from Goldsmiths. We took on the local education authority. We used a local newspaper. It was very much pre-internet and all of that. We used Gestetner, for those of you old enough to remember how you used to photocopy things. And we campaigned against a decision that was made, which was to exclude, well, not to accept me into a local school. And the reason why 1971 is also really important in my story is because I didn't realize till fairly recently that that was the year of the Immigration Act, which meant that the UK government, after going to the Caribbean and other parts of the Commonwealth, they actually then decided that they had enough of us and they would close the borders in a very stark way. And so when I went for an interview at the secondary school, my mother was asked if she was actually a British citizen. Having come to the UK in 1955, she didn't quite understand why she was being asked that. My 5 white friends who actually applied, because I said I was going to apply for that school, they all got in and I didn't. So I learned at a very early age that you could campaign. I also found it quite useful not going to school for 3 months. I quite like that. I was asked if that's what I wanted to do and should there be a campaign, and I said yes, not quite knowing what was ahead of us, but I knew that I wouldn't be in school for 3 months, or at least some months, and it turned out to be 3 months. I went to school in January 1972 after taking on the Education Authority, and we won the campaign. And that actually changed my life educationally. So that was, I learned you could say no. And my mother and father came from a small village in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and they hadn't done much more than basic education, but they knew that we could try it and say no and push the system and actually get a different outcome. So that's a really important part of my journey. I spent many years working in communities, doing consultancy, teaching, and building, community building. However, partly because of my parents being what we now call the Windrush generation, I realized that many migrants come to the UK or move country and say that actually they eventually wanted to go home. However, my parents didn't go home. I'm now 4th generation in the UK. And I began to say, well, if we're not going to go home, if the UK is home, there's a reality check that's a bit uncomfortable at times, then what do we need to do to ensure that we have deep roots here, that we're strong communities, that we're sustainable? And so around 2010, I actually posed a big question. I worked with a group of people who did big systemic change work globally and realized that I was holding a question about sustainability of black communities in the UK. So my big question came about. I was able to apply for a Churchill Fellowship. Yes, we know there's a really suspect history around Winston Churchill. One of the things that happened after his death was that money was given and that about 120 people each year get to go anywhere in the world to look at something they're curious about. And I was curious about black communities and sustainability, next generation leadership, and community enterprise. And I was fortunate to go to Atlanta and sat at the feet of some awesome community leaders, as well as going and spending a few weeks with the Maori community, and actually found real connections between what I knew in terms of the work that I've done in South Africa and the way that they actually also develop communities. So from that early beginning, 2010, 2012, I ended up doing a range of things with people. I think the most important thing that I did in terms of those early days around Ubele was actually to be in dialogue. We facilitated space just for dialogue to say, what are you noticing? What aren't we talking about? What's going to happen if we're going to be here for another 50 years as black communities? And that space for dialogue actually then, out of that, emerged some themes. We were hearing that we were losing our community leaders. We heard that we were losing our community spaces. We heard that our leaders were older and had done their work. I am on the back of leaders who are 80, 90 years old now. Many have passed away. So we began to think about that, and we did a piece of research in 2015, which we're just about to relaunch in January, called A Place to Call Home. We mapped over 150 community assets up and down the country. We worked with UCL students, actually, back then. They were planning students, and we produced a foundational piece of research, which kind of set in motion our kind of vision around community asset development and leadership. We were involved in campaigning a lot. We campaigned against the London plan. As some of you will know, there's a 20-year plan for London. Gentrification is not just incidental, it is planned, it is intentional, it is brutal, it is nasty. And so there we were involved with Just Space around a community plan for London, working with community organisations, as well as a campaign we called Reclaim Our Space. Because community groups around the country, around the world, are being displaced, as we know. We also have worked in ways that have disrupted systems. Where we're based now, we have our own community space, which I'll show you very briefly in a moment. But we had to, even working at those spaces where we work in partnership with white organisations, we've had to step in and said no around plans that they had for the space that excluded black people from there. One of the other campaigns that I'm pretty proud of, actually, that we've done was during COVID. We did a campaign called We Need Answers. We're hearing some interesting things now, aren't we? And the COVID response. But we got 30,000 people to sign a petition, and we wrote to the government, and we threatened to take them to court. And eventually they did respond, a whole load of diatribe, but we were told by our solicitors that it's the first time the government sent a 10-page response to a campaign letter. It was about why were there so many black and racially minoritized community members dying during COVID. That was the genesis of the campaign. So out of all these different activities, we've built an organisation called Ubele, as I said, and we have a number of strategic objectives around enterprise and leadership and infrastructure and developing people. We've done a lot of capacity building, a lot of support around community assets, enterprise, and so on over the last few years. Actually, COVID really jettisoned and catapulted us, actually, into the centre of things in London and across the country, which has been, it's been good, it's been positive, it's been needed, but also, as you know, if you're trying to drive a train and build the track at the same time, it can be a bit, sometimes you can go off rail. You can be derailed slightly. Just a couple of things about what we've, our community space where we are. Wolves Lane's a very magical place. It grows food, it's 3.5 acres. We are building 3 new buildings there, community hub, classrooms, and our offices, and so on. It's been a massive community endeavour. We've raised over £3 million to do it. And we are doing it in collaboration with a white-led organisation, challenging though it is. We have some pretty hard conversations and negotiations. But actually, it's actually very exciting because we're using environmentally friendly material. We're using clay. We're using straw. There's no concrete. We're using recycled wood, and that's not. You don't often get that in urban areas that we can build and teach people skills, and we'll be building that as we go along. I'll just say one more slide, okay? These are my 2 colleagues. I just wanted to say something. It is about the future, actually. Maybe we can come back to this. But what we've been able to do is we'll be launching in January Agbero 2100. Agbero means sustainability in Yoruba. It's got quite an interesting story behind the word. But what we're going to be doing is rolling out the work that we're doing pan-London and nationally. We want to work with about 10 community spaces and to build a system and a network of those spaces and to support them in terms of their infrastructure, their leadership, their redevelopment, because many of the buildings we found, are in pretty poor state. But also we need to support groups to acquire new spaces. And we're going to be doing that launching that, Agbero, alongside a place to call home 2.0 in January, from mid-January onwards. Just one last thing I'd want to say. You know, this work is not for the faint-hearted. We are complex people, and we are also often traumatized people because of the way that the system has impacted on us. I've been fortunate that we've got a great team. We've got a great team, and we're quite playful. We play, we laugh, we cry, and we support each other. But I'm really I feel very grateful to do the work that I've been able to do in the world. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel a little bit like it's one of those days where I was just rushing to make sure I got here, and then hadn't had a moment to even remember and reflect who I'm going to be on a panel with. And then I was just like remembering how much of an honor and a privilege it is to sit alongside people who are doing such important work, but particularly just the chance to go after Yvonne. I don't think we get enough time or chances to say how much gratitude and how much respect with which we should sit with our elders and what they have been able to do in conditions that we will never understand. It doesn't mean that they're more or less hard, but the path they've paved, and I mean, given my small little bit of experience of what it's like to try and put your head above the parapet and be about something and try to build and to try and come back onto the train tracks when it all derails, what it means to have those moments when you're like, oh God, I really shouldn't have been so harsh on those who were building before me when I was so young, and like, but what about this? I think it's really special and important, and particularly building on also what Akil said. I think it's really important to recognize the deep like pain and sorrow and tragedy and horror of this time and what it is to watch in real time things that many of us have spoken about in different lineages of ours, and to watch it in real time, like even to be able to sit here and talk about something propositional. I don't think for like a minute we should take that even slightly for granted. We might not have a moment like this again, and therefore we don't know in an instant at the moment what could happen and change. And so I just wanted to take a moment to say that, because I don't know, like Yvonne is special, but what I know as someone who's in a different generation is that we can go through times where we feel like the thing that we're doing now or we're working on, like, yeah, like I'm on the next, like, I've got the most radical stuff to say, and like, you know, nobody knows more than I do right now. And actually, I think we need to change posture with that and really understand and really listen and really inquire and be really grateful for the time and the labor and the work that people have put in. And Yvonne, you're definitely like one of those in the UK that I think has put in so much work for us to be able to even exist and dream and to navigate the system with more ease, which it might not feel easy, but it's definitely, I've navigated with more ease because of the work that you've done to lay the ground. And so I just really invite everyone to think about that when they're thinking about what does that mean in your own ecology and ecosystem, and what does it mean that we have to do and transcend to come together? Because I'll say some things now that I think you'll be like, okay, cool, that's amazing, I like what Civic Square are doing. But the starting point isn't, I don't think it's like just it isn't just that moment when you're going to run that campaign or go and do whatever. It's the starting point is like when you look around you and you think, even when it's hard, who do I need to radically be in community with, to honor, to look to support? Maybe if I leading something isn't that. And I just felt really called, like, to say it as I was sat next to Yvonne. So I just wanted to say thank you for everything. And yeah, I hope everyone has a moment just to reflect on some of that. And also, a first ever time I'm meeting Gabriella in person, so I'm a little bit starstruck, everyone. Okay, because like everybody has said over the years, we need to meet. So Civic Square, like I was thinking as Yvonne was talking, how shall I take this bit? So I'm just going to say a couple of different things really quickly, and then we can talk in the chat, right? So essentially what Civic Square is interested in is the building of, and building doesn't have to just mean hard hats, the crafting, the visioning, the remaking, reimagining of social and civic infrastructures, very particularly at the scale of the home, street and neighbourhood. And there's a reason for that. To support the climate, social and ecological transitions that we need to make. And I want to say that it's really critical in this time to know what it means to say transition, because I think it's a real privileged piece, right? Like to even be able to have the chance to say we could maybe plan for and be propositional about this is a gift of time that we have stolen from others. And so it really matters to know like this is a responsibility on us, not something that we're just gifted because we stole the chance to transition and have time to think and plan, and that many of our ancestors, peers, kin across the world do not have the chance to. They will be transitioning by horror, by necessity, through disaster, and bizarrely we still have a chance, and I think we're squandering it. So for me, this is something that is really at the heart of our work. And that's why I shared this slide, because at the bottom of the IPCC working group, one report, the future will be different, but just how different is our choice, is really something that actually is not true for everybody. But I still think we have a window, and this is what really drives my, this layer of work. And I could have told you about the origin story, and we can maybe talk about that later. I really feel like often that's quite an important thing that we can all talk about, because it actually helps us to situate ourselves. But really particularly, I just want to say that there's a lot on our work that you can look up, but we were essentially a group of young people in Birmingham responding in the early days to this idea many years ago, 12, 13 years ago, that no one that looked like me or many of the peers on my panel was represented in the structures of the city, and but the young, diverse demographic of Birmingham was lauded as this next generation of leaders. And it started quite naively of just a bunch of us coming together to put on events, and grew significantly in many which ways, which I'm really happy to talk about later, because there's a few things from this story that I think are critical. And we did things like the Impact Hub in Birmingham, and over the last few years we've been organising at a neighbourhood scale at Civic Square. And this is a little bit of some of what our work looks like, just so you can situate yourselves. But really particularly, I've just kept a few slides there, so later when we're chatting we can talk more. At the heart of the question of our work is, what if the climate and ecological transition and the deep retrofit, imagine retrofit being many, many different things, of our homes, streets and neighbourhoods were designed, owned and governed by the people who live there? This is quite a particular question that has a lot in it. It seeks to unpack how our land is owned and stewarded, how things are financed, who benefits from that, what is value, what is the purpose of our economy, who is at the forefront of it. And it sounds like a really big and bold question, and there's lots of beautiful, really inspiring things that I can tell you about our work and the people we work with, and we'll maybe get into that conversation later. But actually I'm going to take the end of this into a bit of a boring direction, because I want to situate why questions like this are so important. Because I think that we have to understand ourselves and our work way beyond our lifetimes. I know that's not going to be an unusual thing to hear in a room like this. But if it is true, uncomfortably true, that the UK is most likely my home, I say it most likely because, something might randomly happen whereby I find myself back home in Punjab in a field somewhere. Then contextualizing that for me means what is it that we're trying to build, right? And for Civic Square, yes, we've got a whole bunch of stuff that I can tell you about, that how we're organized. But particularly a story like this, a question like this might seem absolutely bonkers to most people in power, because they've got a number of ideas of how they will govern and make these changes and shifts. We've seen it, right? So when I turn around and when Civic Square turns around and all of the incredible work that this panel will talk about says, hey, the people are always at the forefront of change, of which everything else follows. At all scales, I believe this to be true, whether it's in what is happening at the moment, in all the actions that are being taken, or whether that's true in how what I'm going to term as something called public goods and public infrastructure was made. There's lots of examples of it all around the world. But let's take a slightly steeped in very troubling imperial history, because a lot of our welfare state is built on the spoils of empire. But let's just take a moment to know that there's a time in this country within the last 100 years where the question, what if everybody had access to health at point of need, not if they could pay, would have been bonkers. Albeit not me lauding the NHS as some perfect institution. And working class communities in industrial towns in South Wales, for example, the Tredegar Medical Aid Society is a great example of this, were organising around their material need, around health, at a time where their lives were deemed like irrelevant and just labour for an industrial revolution that was happening. And people were organising around their material needs in a way that was transformative, that was rooted in mutual aid, that was rooted in what was happening there, but in that place. But there lay the blueprint of what would go on to become a national system. When a question, where we got to a point where health became a public good. Lots of reasons why these things happened that aren't all radical and beautiful. But we went from, in a very relatively short period of time, from a question that was unthinkable to a question that we can't move this place on post-war without this infrastructure. Fundamentally, there's another, and I'm just using this example because you can situate it in your own experience, right? When that national system was built, it was built in a way that then had regional systems and all of that, right? But the neighborhood GP became the place at the heart of your neighborhood, and we'll hear this in a very different context from Gabriella, where you started to have the infrastructure, tools, expertise that you could, as a family, as a person, start to uplift your health. At that time, it was because they needed the economy to work again post the war. So there's also these things aren't perfect, right? Be really clear about that. But why do I bring that example up? Because I think that we are in the middle of the end of systems that are dying, from the purpose of the economic system to the way land is attributed to many of the things that we all know that are happening, and at the kind of that upward curve of new systems and new stories. And we're lucky for all of us, stuck right slap bang in the middle of that yet. That hasn't died yet, but that isn't here yet. What is coming over here could be captured by a lot of people, and normally is. But there are times in history where places and people have chosen to affirm life, to move towards life, to move towards a different idea for the future. And this is essentially what we're working for, right? I'll say this last little bit and then I'll pass over. Practically, and we've got loads on this I can talk about. Oh, okay, some slides have died. This is not well, okay. Never mind, my slides have died. But point to say is we're split up into 3 different types of work. The neighborhood for us is a site of deep imagination. It is a site that is possible, big enough to create structures that could be spreadable, that could take lots of parts, but small enough that you can turn around the corner and be in an intimate relationship. Within it, the homes and streets are able to be sites of radical imagination. And so one of the things we're doing, there'll be loads of other stuff on this slide, is rebuilding this industrial site as a demonstrator of what could be, environmentally, socially, ecologically, if neighbours had the tools, the resources, the knowledge, the data, the connections, each other at the heart of a neighbourhood. Not because I want all of you to go and do massive capital projects like this. That's definitely not what we should be doing. But because there are green spaces, schools, GPs, community libraries, village halls, things that austerity and before, all the things that Yvonne's talking about, has completely destroyed, that we would need to be reimagine. But reimagine for what? And so we're trying to really demonstrate what that looks like through the physical infrastructure. We're then trying to really look at what some of the underlying frameworks and compasses that we work towards. How do we ultimately build life-affirming economies? How do we take the local, the global, the social, the ecological together and think about the tensions that sit in the heart of that, especially in the UK, right, where we've already taken far more than our fair share, and if anything should be regressing backwards into really reducing the way we're thinking about our consumption, our material consumption in the future, and actually becoming a more generative force in the world. And finally, we're really, oh gosh, again, my slides died a bit, but we're looking at how to demonstrate this at a street level, to show what it means to reimagine our streets socially, ecologically, to deal with many of the tensions that are in a lot of the climate and ecological emergency work that we've done. And so I think that there's lots I could talk about, but essentially Civic Square is really understanding that you can be deeply rooted and local and trying to show a full-blown stack of what could be in your place, and that the home street and neighbourhood isn't just this thing that you get to afterwards once you've made the big decision somewhere else. Actually, it's fundamentally the place that we organise, that we understand one another, where big challenges hit us in a really practical way, and thus gives us a real, so the energy crisis turns up in your bills, or the housing crisis turns up in your neighbour's experience, or what happened in COVID turns up in a way you can see it and feel it, and it's a representation of a far larger system. And that means our agency actually to do something and to rehearse the freedoms, to be able to manifest and show what could be, is actually greatest there. And all through history, that is where the people lead, and thus policy and government and all things with the right set of conditions actually follows. So I think today we're trying to build something that demonstrates deeply reimagined futures at neighbourhood scale, but it's in service of our children, our grandchildren, being able to take the things we built today for granted, and actually them not really being able to see, was it Imi, was it Fazana, was it Gabriella? Hopefully they shouldn't be able, it shouldn't be that sort of thread, right? Because when things become a public good, they become something that we take for granted, and I'm actually really like the idea of being able to be erased from that story and be part of a story where we fundamentally change the underlying conditions. So that's a little bit with what we're working on, and there's, you know, it's not for the faint-hearted for all sorts of reasons. I'm happy to talk about that later. Thank you.
Gabriella, just before you start, we've gone slightly over when we were going to break, but I'm hoping that everyone is keen enough. Yeah, a few nods, democratize, cool. Fantastic, take us away.
Hello, everybody. I love that not for the faint-hearted is something that will be repeated, I think, in every one of our presentations. So my name is Gabriela. I hail from Mexico City, and perhaps two things to know about me before I start. One of them is Mexico City is the big, stubborn love of my life, talking about not for the faint-hearted. And as any big love, it has filled me with pleasure and dreams, and it has also broken my heart so many times over and over. The second thing is that actually that love led me into government, which is, if you had known me in my in my life before that is actually a really weird segue in my life because I come from the arts and cultural field. So I have been everything from a journalist, a filmmaker, a artist, a experimental curator, and I very much thought of myself as being part of civil society. A lot of our projects were socially minded, against government, et cetera, et cetera. So imagine that suddenly one day you wake up and you're a bureaucrat. And besides with a Midas touch to turn other activists into bureaucrats as well, which is a very strange thing. But anyway, so for 6 years, I ran Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which was officially the experimental arm / creative think tank for the Mexico City government. I reported directly to the mayor. And for those of you who have not been to Mexico City is 10 million people. It's city proper, 21 million in the metropolitan level. I had no idea, but we have almost 5 million children under age 14 at a metropolitan level, which is, you know, a whole Finland, as I told my Finnish friends. And I had the great privilege of having an amazing team that was quite quirky in many ways. First of all, it was more or less like 20 of us, and half of us came from the urban political sciences and the other half from the humanities. So everything from urban geographers, internationalists, lawyers, administrators, civic tech experts working with philosophers, writers, historians, artists, designers, filmmakers, architects, urbanists, futurists, and everything that we did sat more or less in between. Another particularity is that the average age at the time was around 28 years old, which is more or less the average age of Mexico City. So unbeknownst to me, we were prototyping what government could look like and if it could become relevant once again for a younger generation. And of course, Mexico City being Mexico, I even had Mas Restros on my team, and who kept his identity secret until The Guardian ousted him. So he was a bureaucrat by day and a mass defender of pedestrian rights by night. And I had several activists on my team. Those are stories for another day because it's a threshold and that is quite intense in many ways of passing from the activist world into government, but I think it also made so many of our agendas quite unique. So the things that we were deeply interested was the urban, the political, the social, the creative, and the cultural, all of its entanglements, the tensions and the translations, and how we could start thinking about new urban languages and as well as political forms. Because the first thing that we needed to do, since we were a bridge between the mayor's office and civil society, was to become a strange attractor of sorts. Like what would actually want to make people engage with us when basically in Latin America it has one of the highest mistrusts between government and civil society the world over, and Mexico very particularly. And in many ways, I think some of the big things that became important for the ethos of the lab is prototyping collaborative society, a hybridity of practice, how we could start teasing the boundaries between roles, between disciplines, between civil society and government. How could we think about citizenship itself as a creative act, democracy as a creative practice, and the city itself as a traveling surface for ideas? And one of the things that I had not realized until I jumped into government is that policy is actually a fascinating tool to make reality malleable. Everything that we hold dear in our cities and our lives and our societies is touched by policy. So in a way, I think it's a place that we need to engage with as well. And another thing that was very important to our work is, could we start thinking about cities not only for the human body, but also for the human imagination? And I'll get into that in a second. And this political imagination was incredibly interesting for us and incredibly important because in many ways, the whole idea of the smart city is one of the very few visions that have traveled across the world. But it is, you know, somewhat of an impoverished vision of what society could be, as we were speaking about earlier today. These are, when you type in the future of cities, I didn't choose these. These are the first 5 pages that come up in a Google search. But is that really the cities that we want and that we love? I don't necessarily think so. So one of the things that became incredibly important for us was thinking about visions for a megalopolis and then having a portfolio of experiments that would actually scaffold our way into that reality, into a shared vision of what was possible. And one of the things that for us became incredibly important is the politics of possibility, because we needed to make policy and politics and government and engaging in different ways fascinating again. And once again, like from this vision to the practicalities, what was in the middle? Like, you know, what were the steps that would get us a little bit closer? So this is more or less what a year in the life of one of my teams would look like. My team was divided in 6. Those were the type of city that we imagined: open, pedestrian, participatory, creative, playful, global. And we try to walk a fine line between the critical and the possible. So in many ways, this sounds great, but what does that mean? And I love this phrase by Ursula Le Guin, that I won't say the full thing of it, but this is the thing to know: realists of a larger reality. Because I think we need to be incredibly visionary, but we also need to be deeply pragmatic when we're thinking, as Imi was mentioning, as Yvonne was mentioning, about transforming society and transforming futures. So a little potpourri of the type of things that we worked on. We worked with more than 40 organizations for Mexico City's first road safety plan, talking about the critical, where we managed to reduce deaths related to traffic incidents by 20% in just 2 years. We have the biggest informal bus system in the world, but we didn't have a map of it, so we managed to crowdsource it. This is the 100 winners. We made a citywide game. Who helped us map out the largest informal bus system of Mexico City. We had more than 4,000 people signing up and 700 teams. But we also loved, as Imi was mentioning, working at the neighborhood scale. I agree, there's so much political imagination and day-to-day imagination that goes on there. So really thinking along with people from different neighborhoods and working on things such as urban toys, which was also, besides being urban interventions, sometimes temporary, but that always had the community at its heart of how do we actually articulate into different ways of thinking about our neighborhoods and our society. But then there was also the other scale, the scale of a megalopolis, and we also were able to do things such as crowdsourcing the Mexico City Constitution, that nowadays is our highest law, and has embedded in it things such as abortion rights, transsexual rights, gay rights, indigenous rights, the right to mobility, euthanasia, and a whole series of things. And this is forever and ever. Like we cannot take away constitutional rights after they have been granted. So I cannot stress how important this is in terms of what Mexico City achieved since 2017, that we have a city constitution, which is actually quite a rare thing in many ways. And very particularly, just to see how ideas hit the ground, how policy does have an effect, because of course a constitution is about ideals and aspirations of a society, but it's also our highest law. So we also worked very particularly on Article 20 of the Constitution, which made Mexico City into a sanctuary city. And if you followed the election when Trump was still president, oh my God, what a nightmare. And you saw the caravan in his midterm elections. The reason why, instead of being received by military forces and police when they passed through Mexico City, this is a caravan actually, they were received by medics and food and shelter, was because of Article 20 of the Mexico City Constitution. So that is what it looks like when legal and policy infrastructures hit the ground. And our Constitution also has embedded in it the right to the city, and this is a phrase of David Harvey that I love, that there's actually the charter of the right to the city was made in Mexico City maybe more than a decade back. And it says, the question of what kind of city we want cannot be divorced from the kind of social ties, relationships to nature, lifestyles, technologies, and aesthetic values we desire. The right to the city is the right to change ourselves by changing the city. So it is both imagination and it is rights. And this, I think, leads me to some of the things that I wanted to share today that are related to the work that I'm doing now, is the lesson that Mexico City gave me is how interesting it becomes to do these urban rehearsals, to be able to travel the scale of the city and really think about what infrastructure looks like, which is both physical, spatial, social, relational, and even symbolic, I dare say. And I have had the great fortune since I left government 3 years ago now to be able to work with the willing, and I have become fascinated in accompanying other cities that have progressive agendas and adding the experimental, transdisciplinary, collaborative, and creative edge to many of the projects that I have been involved in. And one of the things that I've been loving is being able to collaborate with cities that are full of vital, restless, ever-evolving, generous, and generative, if difficult, very difficult questions that they're really trying to push forward. So nowadays I run both an organization called Experimentalista and my new wild child that just came into being, that's called the Institute for Everything in Between. And one of the examples is I'm working with the city of Bogota on holding this question together. Can a whole city be reimagined around care? So this is a big philosophical question, and it takes us back to a phrase of John Tronto that I think is very much related to life-affirming infrastructures, that basically defines care as everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Again, an aspiration, a philosophy, something to tend towards, but it's also very practical. Economies of Care tries to bring to the forefront a pending conversation. When we say, oh, my mother doesn't work, which is a phrase that we repeat a lot, unfortunately, in Latin America, it's actually rarely true. Rather, 75% of unpaid work is done by women. And this is a patriarchal pyramid of what our economies really look like. You know, we should be taking this into account in GDPs. So there's a lot of labor policy that has to come into being that really takes into account that women have been the invisible workforce on which backs we have created economies and societies. So what does this mean when, for example, when you do not have a retirement fund because you do not work? Or what does it mean that you don't have access to a social safety net because you do not work when you're actually sustaining a society? So it's a big thing, and this is something that fortunately is coming to the forefront of many conversations. I have had the fortune in Bogota of working with creative bureaucrats, which I love. This is Diana Rodriguez Franco that you can see on my left, on this side, right here on the screen, who's the Minister of Women's Affairs for the city of Bogota, which is usually one of these innocuous ministries in many governments. Mexico has one as well, both at a city level as well as a national level. But fortunately in Bogota, they actually led Bogota's biggest projects, basically because the mayor, the first elected woman mayor in Colombia, as well as the first openly gay mayor in all of Latin America, came in with a feminist support and has made basically care and a gender agenda for Bogota her main thing. So what does this look like? Because they're bringing in not only care economics, which is incredibly important, as I mentioned, but they're also spatializing care. What does this mean? It means thinking about spatial justice, that the way that our cities, especially in Latin America, you know, if you look at numbers, let's say Mexico City has 42 square meters of green space per inhabitant in some neighborhoods and less than 5 in others. So we cannot deal with averages. Averages are tyrants in many ways. So how do we start thinking about the places within our cities, especially the megalopolises such as London, Bogota, Mexico City, that where the provisions are most needed and where there's less on an individual basis, how can the city afford more? How do we go towards caring society and care commons in many ways? So in only 4 years, they have created more than 20 care blocks, which is a really interesting program because it literally is like districts of care that have many provisions, everything from accompanying women that are under violent situations at their home legally as well as psychologically, women that don't necessarily have leisure time or time to even go to the doctor at the same time that they can get skills. For example, the people that they care for, because many of them are care workers, are being cared for by the care block. So people with disabilities, senior citizens, there's a lot of public schools. So I won't get into it, but it's a really interesting way of trying to think about bringing down into the city scale the interdependent quality of care. And again, like spatializing it as well. I also love that care is a quality, like it's not only a policy and a political agenda, but it's a quality. So if you think about housing, this unfortunately is an example from my country. This is how we did social housing for a while, and nowadays I think it's 45% of it has been abandoned. It will come to nobody as a surprise when you see that. But you know, if you just say housing and think about bodies, you can come up with this. But when you think about housing, bodies, and care, you need to think in a completely different fashion. So it really brings in the importance, once again, of political imagination. Last but not least, I'm not only working with cities, but nowadays, fortunately, I've also been working with the vice president of Colombia's team, Francia Marquez. She is a land defender since she's 13. She is the first Afro-Colombian to be in high power, the first Afro-anything in all of Latin America to be in such high power. She went against the Canadian mining companies and won. Her life was at risk. She was a domestic worker not too long ago, and now she's vice president of Colombia. And they're also right now creating a national system of care, and I'm both on the advisory committee with fabulous people such as Arturo Escobar, that I'm sure many of you know, who's just as brilliant in person as he is in his books, as well as indigenous leaders, Afro-Colombian leaders, former senators. It's a motley crew if there ever was one. And basically we've been tasked with creating the design of the national care system for Colombia. So very briefly, and I'll end there because I tend to go long, Mexican time is a thing, as you can see. What Francia brings to the conversation around care I find incredibly interesting and quite new for the world. It's first of all, how do we bring in territory? Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities throughout Latin America, they can't even envision human care without thinking about land and the more than human. So what does that even mean when we're thinking about systems of care to bring in these other components? What does a decolonial and collective care perspective look like? Care not as an individual responsibility, which I think many first world countries have, but rather as a collective right. And that brings really different entry points into the conversation. And last but not least, what does next care infrastructure look like, where we have to take into account that it's not enough for the government to do things in cities, but we actually also have to take into account a pluriversal way of thinking about care that comes from the indigenous Afro communities. And so we need to really think about a scaffolding, if you will, that is able to articulate all of these worlds. So these are some of the questions that I've been working with, very much related again to rehearsing futures, rehearsing freedoms, as well as life-affirming infrastructures. Thank you so much.
Okay, now that we've all switched seats and heard some absolutely brilliant speakers, I told you I wasn't lying when I said they're really inspirational and the top and the kind of progressive of the game. Should we take a quick 5 minutes so everyone can shake their legs, get some snacks, drink some water, and then we'll be back for much, much more. Okay, everyone, if you'd like to make your way back to your seats, I hope everyone's well fed, well watered. If you just press deny. And then deny again. Yeah. Hopefully that works out. Okay, amazing. So, one of the things I thought was really important within this talk, everyone has spoken in great detail and really inspirational fashion around what it is that they do. But often, what we require as an audience, as fans, as admirers, is to understand the context behind these individuals, behind these organizations. They come from different cities, Mexico City, Birmingham, London, and different times in those cities and those trajectories. So we're going to go into a deep dive behind that before we can reconcile with the future. And Gabriella, I want to start with you, because you spoke very, very briefly about your work prior to being in government, and glossed over some pretty phenomenal roles, you know, as a journalist, as a documentary maker, your time in Toxicocultura, and I'd like you to speak a little bit about that, and paint the scene of Mexico City during this time.
You do your research. So yes, I come from arts and culture, as I had mentioned, and I think one of the big joys that I always have had from the cultural and the arts field was actually one of my slides, the capacity to make reality malleable. There is a suspension of disbelief in certain ways. There is a way of truly trying to explore the otherwise, how things could be, of bringing in imagination. And I was particularly interested in all of my capacities with the artists and the work that really straddled worlds, that were deeply social and inherently about imagining other types of futures, and at the same time that really were masterful with the means and mechanisms of art. So actually in my role, because I didn't mention that, but I was a chief creative officer for Mexico City was my title. And language is the first Trojan horse. So in government, this really matters, because whatever your title is also your attributions. And I'm still waiting to the state that somebody comes up and says, like, you know, that's not what a chief creative officer does. But this very much was inspired by my past. I think in many ways, all of these roles gave me different entry points into Mexico City. As a journalist, I still remember every time I had a new story, be it covering, you know, doing a reportage on some of the dumps of Mexico City, to being in the soap opera world for a month for Colors magazine, or doing an article for Vice on what do you call this in English? Homemade porn. I think it would be the closest thing. Yes, it actually is. So, which was very, yeah, and I mean, there's many anecdotes around that, but my life was very varied. Like, you know, sometimes I was interviewing the mayor of Mexico City, or flying in a helicopter for the BBC, or working with Marina Abramovic in my Fabrica days. So you really are a good researcher. Like, I rarely speak nowadays about my past life, just because there's so many other things to speak about. But yes, this was actually incredibly influential in the way that I thought of government, because I think the first reenchantment that needed to happen was me finding an entry point into why I would find government interesting. Because again, like, I had been completely oppositional to it. I really thought, down with institutions, down with government. Nowadays, I feel differently. I think we need very different institutions, but I feel that the social energy needs places where it can be amplified and augmented and replicated into the future. So thinking about good public institutions, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about government, thinking about policy, like, all of these are tools to make reality malleable. And I feel that the working within ecologies, as you had mentioned, I think is one of the most important things that we have at a city scale, but within any society. So, I mean, all of my lives had things that were interesting for me in government. When I was a documentary filmmaker, my feature-length documentary, and then I entered government, was called The Man Who Lived in a Shoe. And it is about a man who lived in a shoe, like very literally. I will tell you the ending, but it's a true story. But that documentary was about a quixotic imagination, which was also really interesting to think about within government, because as I mentioned as well, like, you know, having visions of what is possible is not enough. We need to scaffold them. We need to be deep pragmatics at the same time that we hold visions of what is possible. And being able to, as Yvonne and as Imi do, to be able to sway between these two things is incredibly important. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but it was very influential in government. The life before it, and I was also the only woman at the time that was leading a lab, as well as the only person that came from arts and culture, because most of my colleagues came from the policy world or more from like the startup world. Whereas culture became very much embedded within the ways that we thought of projects at the lab, because culture, in deep culture, is the way that we make meaning, much more than a 5-step super rational engineering anything. Like, you know, this is the place to intervene, no? Like deep culture, relationality, urban imaginaries. So that became very important for the work that we did, and that I still do now.
Absolutely amazing. And I'm going to take one of Gabriella's phrases around tools to make reality malleable, transfer that from Mexico City to an equally beautiful and sunny city called Birmingham. Some of you may know. And I was torn with this one, Imi, I have to say. And perhaps you'll find a way of welding these two together, because I'd really like you to speak around the types of community work that you came out of. Radical Sikh community movements in Birmingham, the community halls, and try and weave your story up until TEDx.
Thank you. So I guess my story is a bit wonky, if I'm honest, because it doesn't really make sense until you look backwards towards it. Because I'm going to be really honest, I am 38, so I'm like a geriatric millennial. And I was the daughter of parents who migrated here with their parents post as very young children after the partition of India. And I was like that, you know, generation that came from stunning roots and didn't know, like, until I was in my 20s. Because my parents and my grandparents before them were trying to be here and cope and rebuild their dignity, and were working in really difficult conditions in a really difficult backdrop that I guess Yvonne would know much more about as well, practically. And so their thing was that like proper immigrant like education, right? It doesn't matter, you're just gonna educate your way out of this and you're gonna have a life that we didn't have. And it was very much from a very, very full and heartful place, but it was like the epitome of the story of like neoliberal economics was like the journey that they thought was the one that was going to be like the right one. And so I was just like a very well-behaved, like stick to what you're here for, right? Don't like first daughter as well, so like eldest kid thing. And I was just like really particular about everything that I needed to do, and was like at school, you know, we weren't where we are now, whereby everything about us was part of what we were trying to bring for. It was like actually you were trying to hide a lot of things and you were just trying to cope, and that was the life you had at home. But then at home, I was like in this intergenerational household, raised by my parents and my grandparents, learning about a radical and incredible Sikh lineage. And so these two worlds were very like separate. And I just like followed the route of doing, like having a career until it all sort of smacked me in the face. The really fast unlearning and relearning and understanding. Obviously, there was lots of things that built that. That's why I say so deeply, like how much we have to thank the ground that our elders and our ancestors created, because it's easy to think all the time, like as a generation, that we've got it all right and we've got no work to do. If it hadn't been for everybody I know in this work that very quickly helped me to learn and unlearn in my 20s after I'd graduated, and lots of things had happened, I haven't got time to talk about all of that. Like if I hadn't had all of that generosity, that care, that extra moment, that moment to say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? That forgiveness of after I found myself in an internship with Tony Blair, right? And can you imagine? Like, and like if it hadn't been for the, it's okay, Imi, we'll help you through understanding and all the generosity of so many people, that I wouldn't have gone through that. And I share that like quite deeply because I think I'm not saying that we want to move back 2 generations or 2 decades and go back to, but I'm saying like I think we all have a responsibility to like create capacity and spaciousness. Some of the organizing spaces that I've been in recently around the actions for Palestinian solidarity have been amazing in Birmingham, because they've just created like rooms and tables where there are people willing to have conversations that that might be uncomfortable, that might be a bit clunky, that might you're allowed to say the things that you're scared to say, so you can unpack them. And so that's what kind of landed me to the work, like at 2021, like a very fast unraveling and unlearning of everything that an education system had taught me, particularly just even to take it out of the realm of just my own personal unlearning. I remember when I joined 00, where lots of things that are now reimagining land or housing or all the things that I've been like working with in Dark Matter Labs and all of these things that you can look up a bit more about. Like I remember my first week, I was like talking to Alistair Parvin, one of my now colleagues who's working on reimagining housing and the land contract and the planning system. I was like, who said you could do this? Like, I was like, who? And he was like, what's wrong with this? Who is this person Indy's dragged in, right? Like, because I was just like, who said you can do something? Going, I don't understand. I was like, who said you can just decide that? Because I hadn't grown up in that. And he was like, you know, obviously there's a big reflection of privilege and all of these things about feeling like you can. But there was like a rapid unlearning for me. Except then when I looked back, I also realized that, hold on a second, this was just a very temporary moment of history where the impacts of colonization had almost created like a, you know, you see those movies, like a memory block. Like there was just this period of time when my grandparents and parents became this good immigrant model to cope in this country, except that I came from ancestors who resisted the British occupation of India. The Sikhs had, in many, many different ways, had their histories erased, our people erased, our institutions erased, like sovereignty erased, and we're only just rebuilding that and trying to understand the roots which we'd come from and to. So my 20s were like this rapid learning and unlearning, and I'm pretty sure that the fact that most of you are here means that you're on some other journey with that. But I promise you there'll be people, really, really good people around you that will be able to benefit from you being like, hey, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time immersing myself in like understanding why someone's coming from where they are, because I definitely did not have anything in my upbringing that made me like that wasn't coming from a beautiful and loving and generative and obviously quite a lot of trauma space, and still I had no clue because I just wasn't part of this like in that time a movement that was resisting and learning. So yeah, I guess that's what sort of brought me to my 20s, and then very, very quickly going through jobs and then realizing and learning that most of the systems that are deeply harming us have been people-made, largely man-made. They can be remade. That learning, I guess, that penny drop moment, that combination of generosity, that being part of an ecology, then started to like rapidly change my reality. And what I've done ever since is try to take the responsibility of that really seriously and return our lineage back to that moment where it got completely fucked by partition, completely. And try and take us back to like a moment where we know who we are able to like stand proud, and that no generations after us will go through what my parents or grandparents did when they were invited to this country to rebuild it after having their own completely destroyed by, and that's, I guess, and when I say return, I don't mean it in a nostalgic way, I just mean to really acknowledge what ended up happening. And so I guess I don't want to talk about my different jobs, but I just want to say, like, I have made some questionable choices, and I didn't fucking know, and I just want to say, like, listen, like, we need to help each other, okay? That's all I say.
Please don't ask me what questionable choices
No. I mean, oh gosh. That phrase, so thank the ground, and I think that moves us so beautifully onto Yvonne. And you spoke about your parents in some way as being, I mean, to preface, I think we're talking about life-affirming infrastructures here in this talk, and they've mentioned that in the current and the present. But why I wanted to unearth the past is because it's not possible to speak about an infrastructure without historicizing ourselves, and without also talking about where the constituent parts of the infrastructures have grown. Yvonne, you spoke about your parents and getting into haberdashers, and in some way they were...
name the school.
I knew the school. And how they, in some ways, were a radical black infrastructure. But your beginnings as a kind of professional are really around the mid-'80s, the Lambeth Girls Project, etc. This time in Britain, I think, is a really important time, and one that is being rediscovered. You were also in Guyana for a little bit, and I think, which is probably, it sounds kind of perhaps maybe out of the ordinary to us now in the 21st century, but actually this is a time of black internationalism. This is a time at which a lot of groups who are doing the work here are also doing the work in other countries. Could you paint the scene for us of London in the mid-'80s and the work that you were doing during this time?
Okay, well, wow, what a question, thank you. Actually, I'll just go back a few more years towards the 70s, because actually it was the very early 80s. It was the early 80s. But I came back to London from Birmingham in 1982, having spent a couple of years surrounded by anti-apartheid movement activists who became refugees in this country, who were actually heavily victimized by the British government and the South African government, and found themselves stateless and homeless and determined to fight the racist apartheid system. So I found myself, it was a very exciting time actually to be surrounded by this group, some of whom I'm still very much in contact to this day. In fact, unfortunately, one of them passed away in September. But sort of 40 odd years of friendship, but also politicization, you know, sort of still reverberates around me because of obviously post-apartheid. And I spend a lot of time in South Africa, and now I go at least a couple of times a year. So that was happening in that context. When I came back to London and got involved in setting up Lambeth Girls Project, which then became Lambeth Young Women's Project, quickly realised that the role of black women youth workers or in working with young people was one that was marginalised. As black women activists, we often described ourselves as womanists, which comes from Alice Walker, and we found ways to convene across London on a regular basis to talk about work with black young women, the work we were doing. And in fact, it's very interesting. I did this this kind of reflective exercise earlier this year. It's called Circles, where younger activists come together around an older activist, an elder activist. And I found a document that I wrote in 1984 about issues facing young black women at the time. And I could have written it yesterday. I was absolutely blown away. The issues of racism, the issues of being excluded from particular spaces, lack of opportunity and so on. It was just the same story. And I felt very sad about, well, not just sad, I felt incredibly angry that where's the fundamental shifts and change been over the last 40 years. I also actually got this job after Lambeth Girls Project, which took me into central government at the time, education in particular. I worked at County Hall, which I think is now Saatchi and Saatchi Gallery or something. And I actually worked pan-London, convening groups of black women youth workers. And we set up a group which actually has been an anchor group of women. They are still very much in my life. They're my daughter's aunties. And that group was called Aratabar. It was a group of Asian and African women. And then after some years it split, and people like Pratibha Palmer were part of the Orat group. And these women were heavily dedicated. We used to meet on Saturdays, so outside the normal 9 to 5, and talk about the work we're doing and develop resources for black young women. There were also a number of political uprisings, incidents, responses to state brutality. Of course, I'm actually an interloper in North London. I'm actually born and brought up in Lewisham. We had the New Cross fire in 1981. We had obviously the Brixton uprisings, which have just, again, the 40th anniversary of that period. And there were, it was quite a male-dominated world as well. I mean, women had their space and did the, really foundational work. But actually, I think as women, we had to fight quite hard at times to have our voices heard as black women in communities. And I know your mom and others wrote Heart of the Race, which has just been re-released in 2021. But it was really important for us to have stories and narratives of black British women and our experiences that we could draw from and learn from. I think that's something that's been a bit sad for us as older leaders, and we have to take responsibility for that to some extent, is that a lot of younger leaders look to America, which is where we looked for models and narratives and actions. And we're like, well, where's our story in all of this? We actually did and have done decades of work. Where's our models? And I think one of the things with Ubele we're trying to think about, what's the model that we're creating of working in communities that can actually, be put alongside other models nationally and globally. And that's something that we're beginning to kind of inquire into. What else should I say? I was in Guyana, and I did have a questionable job there. I worked for an international organization. The reason why I say it's questionable was because I was fortunate in the sense that I had a regional job, so I was all over the Caribbean region. However, I think I was only in my mid-20s, so I think I was a little bit young for what I was trying to do. But again, it introduced me to the Caribbean region. I'd never been there before. My parents are Jamaican. So actually, I found myself in a very interesting place, being from but not of. It was like kind of, trying to navigate this space. My home was Guyana, but I was, working throughout the English Caribbean region at the time. What else do you want to know about that period? I think that period shaped me, yeah. I love your analogy of stunning roots. I'm really clear that I have stunning roots. I'm one of 10. I had 9 siblings. Unfortunately, 2 passed away in the last 18 months, but I'm one of 10. Youngest daughter, so got away with quite a lot, which was good for me. But but actually, yeah, that period, seminal period in my 20s, yeah, the women. They just my anchor women, and they still are very much with me, in my 60s. So yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. I don't want to take up too much time with my own questions, so now I'm going to hand it to the floor because I know you guys must be bursting. I do want to put something out into the ether just so it can knock around while these questions are going, which is around our present ecologies and the people that we're also working around, how we can invoke those names, those heroes that we're kind of working around, the people that we're working with on our page. But I'll pass it on to the audience to ask your questions. So. There's got to be someone. Dima's reaching her hand out. Get the ball rolling.
Thank you all very much. It's been such a beautiful evening listening to all of you. Thank you. My question is actually to Imi. And thank you so much for everything you've contributed, and especially for touching upon the migration experience and the people who set the grounds and the first generation migration experience that's completely different from the second and third. And my question is particularly about what you shared around coming from stunning roots and from a population of people that was essentially incredibly harmed by the empire and the British colonialism. And it might be too personal, so you don't have to answer it. How did you find a way to reconcile that with being on the island, doing the work you're doing? And this is a question I'm asking because I'm sitting a lot with those kind of notions right now, especially with everything going on.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for the question. And I think that, this also builds to the last point that Akil made, right? Like, the journey I've been on has not been one that has actually been one that has been alone, right? It has been really, really deeply around me. Incredible people, peers, kin, people doing really special work, giving me space and time and being able to live their own realities and be able to share those. There's so much, particularly from the radical black tradition, feminist traditions, that have taught us all how to reclaim our own dignities and histories. And I, definitely have been able to be part of that, and benefited more than I have contributed. And I think that's really important to say, because that's what helped me to even understand and contextualize myself around all of this, kind of what I'd say brain damage. I'd literally say brain damage that we had about Sikhs as the model minority, and what happened in this country as we bought into neoliberal economic stories and became the biggest landlords, became the biggest property owners, pursued having more BMWs with personalized registration numbers when we were younger than anything else, right? I grew up in a really weird time. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't amazing work happening within that, but I couldn't see it. The predominant story was the model minority. And we were played, right? We were played and played as well, and we played the game. And there's been a lot of that. 9/11 was a moment where I realized that when the first person was killed through a hate crime in the US. It was a Sikh man, and some of the things that came out immediately after that was like, was the Sikh saying, he's not a Muslim, he's a Sikh. And that radicalized me, right? Because I was like, what do you mean? The first thing we're not saying is like, he's not Muslim. Do we understand what's going on here, right? And I started to really learn how much trauma and what I'm going to say is like, I don't know, impact on our psyche all of this had and what we had played into. So when you see all of this, like, I don't hold us solely accountable, right? Because there is a history here that also literally by design erased us from India and took out so much of the radical roots from our understanding that we're only now grabbing back, right? Like, grabbing back. I could tell you tens and thousands of stories of our educational infrastructures, our archives, our places of worship, our Sikh men. There's loads of projects. The Insaf project is a legal project that documents all of this. And so when you see all of this, like, how do you start to even reconcile with all of that, right? Because we're also part of the problem right now. And I'm okay to say that. Not doesn't mean that we are like, there's not reasons. It doesn't mean we're not traumatized. It doesn't mean all the things that have happened haven't happened. They have. It doesn't mean that I didn't also have an incredible upbringing that really tried to tell me about my history, but I mistook it for like a nostalgia because I was busy trying to just fit in with whatever was going on at school, right? So the way I reconcile is that I think that, similar to what Yvonne was saying, like, I don't think I'm leaving here, and I do think I have a goddamn responsibility to some of that, because I also am I've also benefited from those privileges, as well as being someone who, and so in those entanglements becomes our liberation. Instead of trying to run away, I think, from a reality, I think that being able to hold these many different stories and do, albeit clunkily, albeit with sometimes questionable choices, albeit with the very, very deep gratitude we should have to those who didn't either have the privilege of those questionable choices or chose not to take them and taught us different ways forward. That's one part of grappling with it here. And then another part is really that there is so much that has been lost from our history, that a romanticized notion that where I am from is not in the same violent relationship with a state that hates us, is also, it's a romanticized notion. So there is no place for me to go back home. I would be it was stuck between worlds. So I really try, and I know this word is not like a very sexy one, but I just try and lean into the responsibility and the privilege and the opportunity that this time we stole from those back home. What am I going to do with it? What's the best I can do with it? And how do I model the fact that a couple of really big things can be true simultaneously? And as a community, as Sikhs, we have to grapple with the anti-blackness in our communities, the Islamophobia, as well as grapple with all the other stories that are the literal opposites of that, of solidarity, of kinship, of radical histories. And we've got to do the really hard yards of building those things. And I just think that's it. And so it's not a very sexy radical answer. It's like full of a lot of contradictions and shit. And that really is the world and the work. And that's how I'm like, okay, I'm here, so I've got to try. And I've got to be able to look back and say the Sikhs alongside alongside their kin, were able to build deep roots and really transform what it means for us to exist and take up space and rebuild our worlds here. And I don't know, one question is, I don't know what that means at the moment for where my ancestors were born. We've got our own struggles around losing our land, losing our place, and so that international story and solidarity and work is still developing, I think, for us, and we've got to figure that out. But I guess I'm just trying to roll my sleeves up and be as part of that as I can be.
More questions? Yes.
Much for your work, first of all, and for today. My question would be, I would like to go back to the practicalities you were talking at the beginning, because you all have touched upon the idea of, or the topics of intergenerational work. I was wondering, how are you maintaining among generations in your collectives, in collective work with your collaborators, the legacy of your work, but also how do you pass knowledge so that the knowledge is not missed, is not lost, and people don't have to restart? Because I feel that sometimes there can be an issue.
A really amazing question. Perhaps, Gabriella, you can mention that in response to some of the trans-local work that you're doing, trans-boundary governance, and then also Yvonne around actually the deep-seated roots within the city that we're in right now.
It's a great question that potentially has different scales and different unfoldings in the different work that I've been doing. So in terms of Mexico City, one of the things that I didn't mention is that Mexico City travels at a different speed than most of Mexico, in terms of human rights, in terms of a progressive society, in terms of potentially being more generous in the multiplicity of ways of belonging to it, because so many times, and this is what I'm fascinated by the city scale, is to Ami's point about these complex senses of belonging. Like, many times what we have in common is the city and its future, and our histories, and the way that we think of ourselves in a community can be quite different. So in terms of Mexico City, the whole history of Mexico City, I think, comes from really deep-seated social movements that have actually been the foundation of the rights that we have, many times actually spearheaded for the continent, actually. You know, we were the first to allow for gay marriage, have some of the most progressive transsexual rights in the whole of, actually, not only the whole of the Americas, but in the whole of the world. And this comes from roots that are, in those terms, quite urban, but still of social movements from ages back. And I think that there's a sense of continuum, if you will, of handing over of generations. And I also feel that right now there's an interesting tension between generations in Mexico City, particularly because there's a lot of reading about past roots and Latin American social movements, and at the same time some divisive agendas that are also an interesting threshold to walk across. In terms of Colombia, one of the things that has really interested me, especially in the Colombian context, like, you know, and when I mean Colombia as a country, not Bogota specifically, is that many of the fabulous indigenous and Afro leaders that are at the table, I mentioned about the role of territory and of land, but there's also ancestral wisdom that comes into play. And this has been encoded in everything from rituals to ways of thinking about care, to very different ways of thinking about social infrastructure, everything that's encoded in language. You know, just Mexico has 200, I mean, they've been dying off, unfortunately, but, you know, 200 languages at one point that have since then become 60, and these are not dialects, and same thing with Colombia. So I have the feeling that there is a reminder in many ways nowadays of what it actually means to pull back and think forward through our past and through things that have slowly accumulated.
As an intergenerational organization, because, you know, one of the things was the need to find very practical ways to pass the baton, colloquially, yeah. And we realised actually that we didn't have models or processes for doing that, and that often spaces were not intergenerational, and when they were, that was quite contested in terms of power dynamics and relationships. We've done a number of things actually, and I think because we've managed to take almost 1,000 community leaders to different European countries to do different kinds of creative experiences, introducing the people to things like appreciative leadership, art of hosting, those kinds of creative ways of being, that those spaces have been intergenerational, which has been really amazing, because if you spend 5 days with somebody, you actually build relationships across those real age boundaries. We've also just started an initiative called the Cane Row Project, and that's an intergenerational space and a program for older women leaders, black leaders, and younger women black leaders to share stories and collect those, and to develop leadership programs in a really conscious way. You know, the last thing I'd say is that the intergenerational work probably happens without even knowing it. You know, after I spoke about the women, I just thought about 3 women who I just wanted to be around. They're now 80 and 90, and they're Sybil Phoenix, who fostered over 1,000 young women. She's still got the Marsha Phoenix Home for Young Women in Brockley. She's nearly 90. Mavis Clark, who passed away last year, she repealed the SUS laws, which is a precursor to Stop and Search. It was a vagrancy act that was used to stop black young men. And also Marlene Bogle, who ran Brixton Black Women's Centre. She also passed away, unfortunately, in her 60s. But these were women when I was in my 20s and they were in their 40s. I wanted to be around. I wanted to be like them. They were just, you know, feisty, challenging women who just didn't take no for an answer. And actually, I feel that some of their skills and experiences just rubbed off on me, and strategies rubbed off on me by me being around them. So yeah, it can be difficult, and I'm aware as an older woman when I walk into spaces where I'm the eldest, potentially, the grey hair doesn't lie, amongst other things, but actually it's also, you know, where I feel alive, and you know, just my thinking is stretched, incredibly stretched, and I learn new things. And you know, those spaces also, I've got a daughter who's 29, nearly 30, so actually I have that opportunity in my own life as well to be in spaces with her, my nieces, and other younger women where, where I can also kind of, it's funny actually, because when I go into shops and people call me auntie and mummy, I'm like, how did I arrive here? You know, when did that happen? And I kind of bristle a bit, but then I think, okay, actually, they're saying something about you that's actually quite heartwarming as well. So I live with those contradictions as well, of feeling sometimes 25, but actually knowing that I'm really not. Thank you.
On that note, could you all join me in a round of applause for our guests? Thank you so much. And yeah, have amazing, amazing evenings. Fadhana's about to say something, sorry.
An incredible host, and just to thank our tech and film team, as well as ICF, and also our community stewards. Steph had to catch her train, and also our BSL, so just thank you so much for staying and doing that. Thank you all so much. Just a reminder that we've got a few more events, and one in particular that's relevant to this week that's relevant is one on Afrofuturism, but also specifically looking at legacy and history. That's on Thursday, live streamed, and then rehumanizing ends, like really looking at neighborhoods and the life that emerges and grows in those spaces, and the humanity that you all spoke to. Just again, thank you so much. We could have those love on the chat for you guys on live stream. That's a new reality show. That is my low-key secret that I want to. Next time, no rehearsing freedoms, just love stream. Thank you so much. There's a small point that I want to kind of affirm in this space. One, which is Akil, I've seen you many times root yourself in the stunning roots of Black feminism. The etymology of rehearsing freedoms isn't from that space, but particularly this panel where you've synthesized so much. Like it's three women who've the undercurrent of infrastructure. Like often the times when we think of infrastructure, it's very masculine, and you've all really talked about care as being an infrastructure that holds us together. So just really thanking you all four of you, for the work that you do in building that relational and care infrastructure that we get to be part of. So thank you, be well, and in the spirit of collective care, if anyone wants to help us pack away chairs, we'd love that. Thank you.